activist, but what do you say to your critics?
Necessary for strategic plan protecting. Again, you're being an activist. I am not.
That's not appropriate, sir.
Who are you with? What's your name?
That's not an appropriate question for you to ask.
You're going to ask how many questions? You get 3?
What a stupid son of a bitch.
Good morning, Liberty lovers, Liberty curious, and anyone else tuning in to Friendly Fire. If you're watching live, let me especially thank you for tuning in so early. This show is dedicated to interviewing libertarian candidates running for office and only libertarian candidates. As the name suggests, candidates will be asked some tough questions. But as a fellow libertarian, I'm not here to make them look foolish or fail. Simply raising the bar for interviewing candidates and the expectation for our candidates. The Libertarian Party is the third largest political party in the United States and the only viable option to compete with the big two. If we're going to compete, then let's do so at all levels. Be the candidates, party leaders, and yes, even our podcast. In this episode of Friendly Fire, I bring on Dennis Misigoy, who is the Libertarian Party U.S. Senate candidate for Florida. He was previously on the Libertarian Party Webathon, which I'll link in the show notes. So let's go ahead and bring Dennis in.
How you doing, sir?
Good morning. How are you?
Good. And you?
I'm doing very well. Up early and at 'em.
Yeah. But hey, man, get out before everybody else. Let's start the conversation, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that it was a weird decision to make in going at 7:30 a.m. because people were like, "Are you serious?" And I was like, let's get a candidate in here and get a good vibe for the morning, and then get people something to watch maybe throughout the day if they're able to, maybe on their lunch break or something like that. So we'll see how it goes. I may have to, we may have to adjust. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
But so let's go ahead and just start right off here. Let's, people know the show. The show is Friendly Fire. Bring you on, ask me maybe a tough question or two here and there. Maybe push back if you're not being so diligent in responding. But go ahead and just kind of tell people about you and who you are. Give your kind of like your 2 or 3 minute elevator pitch.
Sure. As mentioned, my name is Dennis Misigoy, the Libertarian candidate for the U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. I don't think there's any secret that we face a lot of, major issues right now in the country. I think one of the most pervasive ones that affects all of us as individuals directly is the inflation, which is driven by all the kind of crazy stuff that government has done, in particular over the last 2 years, where spending has just gone off the charts. It's the same reason we have a $30 trillion debt. Another one of those things which has historically driven it has been military spending as well. We have a foreign policy that seeks out to pursue American hegemony globally, basically try to play kingmaker all over the world. This and so many other terrible things that our government does is why I want to stop so many of these things. The reason why I'm running, it's not for any reasons of my own. I am not very far from being a career politician. Let me say, I'm a career software developer, so I would much rather be, as the name of the podcast is Liberty Dad. I'd much rather be focusing on stuff with my family and everything else. I got 3 kids and my wife here at home. But, because we know that there is a need and we can't just sit by as these, I don't want to shy away from the word evil as these things exist in our nation, and they're being done with our tax dollars and everything else. I can't turn a blind eye to it. And so I've decided to step up. I've served in public office locally before, so I'm trying to take some of that experience and just everything I know. And like I said, can't sit on the sidelines. So I've decided to step up and do something, and that's running here for Senate. So that's me.
Awesome. Okay. So you mentioned that you had a prior, that you've won, that you were an elected official or representative in the past, and you had mentioned that on the LP Webathon. So go ahead and tell us about that real quick.
So I ran at a very local level, and this to sort of juxtapose against me, running now for U.S. Senate, which obviously is something seems like very pie in the sky to most folks within the party. There's a big effort to focus on the local races, and that's what I did the first time I ran. I ran in 2016 at a very, very local level, a special taxing district where I used to live in Miami-Dade County. And we had some issues kind of going on in the community at the time. We had some very kind of consternation with some folks who had gotten onto the board as appointees, really, who were pushing a certain project, and community was very against it. I attended one of these public workshops regarding it, and the only recourse that was suggested to us was basically, if these guys won't support what you do, you support somebody else when the election comes around, and if nobody's doing that, and if there's nobody you can support, we got to step up and run. And so that's what I did. And in 2016, I won seat number 1 on the board with 63% of the vote. It was then the chairman for 4 years, although for the first 2 of those years, I really couldn't do quite really anything. It was a lot like what I imagine the experience, just at a smaller level, the same experience that's going to be for any libertarian who finally gets elected to go to Washington, D.C. They're going to go there and they're going to be alone. They're going to be there and they're not going to be able to do anything that they want to for the first, piece of their term in office. But I was able to stand up as a voice for reason. The people in the community saw it. They were aware of it. When the midterm elections came around, we had a little bit of turnover in the board. And even though they weren't libertarians, the other folks who came in, they were people I could work with. And we succeeded in doing some good things. Cut the previously approved spending on some big projects by around 78%. Very unpopular stuff. Not a whole lot of people wanted. And we brought a lot of transparency by making meetings much more accessible to people. And even towards the end, managed to kind of dissuade people away against from a project that, again, would have wasted some money. There really wasn't a need for it, but especially I think the biggest thing was really unpopular with the people it would most affect. And, kind of diffusing a situation like that within the community. That was one of the last things I was able to do. I left from there in the beginning of 2001. And yeah, that's about it for it.
Gotcha. So tell me about on that, in that position, what was your hardest won success?
I think I don't know, man, because I spent like I said, the first 2 years just up against it. I lost every vote, 4-1 or 3-1 if somebody happened to miss the meeting. No emotion I even made even got a second, unless it was, approve the meeting minutes or adjourn the meeting. That was basically it. Then, but once I had the turnover, solving some of those problems was not that difficult. Not that the other guys who came on were necessarily yes men, but we were able to kind of say, okay, we don't want to move forward with this. Okay, so let's cut that and let's cancel this. But it wasn't until I had that turnover on the board. So in the terms of like just a wear you down, just in terms of a wear you down, like just draining you for years sort of thing, I would say the first couple of things where, we had some of these projects that were pushed for a long time. And then it gotten approved, to be honest with you, it had been approved, and then we were able to cut them. That was certainly something. But I think this one project for like fencing off a particular area in the community at the end was something I was especially proud of, just because at the end of it, like, I didn't expect to win that. I expected that fully to go through. I thought, because that was actually pushed by one of the guys who came on the board after. He thought this was a great idea, and every other supervisor on the board was on board with it. They had all sort of agreed, and the project had just sort of making decisions on the project had just kind of dragged out, because there was decisions about the aesthetics and the materials and how exactly the design was going to be and everything, and this had drawn it out. But I remember we had that last meeting in 2020 where it was very, very harsh between the community and the board. A lot of angry stuff being said when we had the public comment section. And like I said, I very much, for all the animosity that was there, I very much expected that that was going to go through. I just had kind of resigned myself, say, well, this is just what's going to happen. But it was a funny thing that happened on that meeting where at the end, after we finished the public comments on it and said, well, now it's time for the supervisors to decide what they want to do. So I was the first one to kind of speak, and I just said, look, guys, is this really worth it? And I don't mean just the monetary cost, because that's kind of very cut and dry. And you guys have kind of already agreed to that in principle. But what's the cost in terms of just this conflict in the community? What's the cost in terms of, pissing off your neighbors, basically, and for what? What are you getting for having this conflict in the community, having this, and it somehow resonated with these guys, and the guy who had originally proposed this thing, he was the first one to kind of respond and say, you know what, I think you're right, and need to step back. So that was, again, I don't know if to say like the most hard fought, or I'm not even sure exactly how you'd originally phrase the question, but that was one I was especially, especially proud of and surprised of, and it was a real nice cherry on top of the whole time I'd spent in office there, was the fact that we were able to do that, or that it was able to happen that way, because like I said, I fully expected that one to go through. I knew the other stuff would go through when it happened 2 years earlier. But then I knew once we had some turnover that I'd be able to chip into that. Not everything I wanted to, but this was one where I fully expected to lose, and we managed to win. So I was
Good.
very proud of that.
Okay, so let's shift over and talk about your Senate run. Are you fully qualified and on the ballot then?
We are fully qualified. We are on the ballot for November. It's funny if you go through and look on the through the Division of Elections, when you see where we are, it'll have the list of Senate candidates, and because we're partisan, because Libertarian Party is recognized here in the state of Florida, and just like the line for Marco Rubio, because he has no Republican opponent in the primary. Both of us show on the row for primary, it says unopposed. So we are there as partisan candidates for November, but we have no primary, so we're not. We don't have to worry about anything coming up now in August. We are ready to go for November. So.
Okay, so I didn't check, but because I try to focus mostly on the Libertarian candidates, and sometimes just doing the things that I do keep me a little bit less informed than I need to be. So who are your opponents?
So we have obviously our illustrious incumbent, Marco Rubio. There's a slate of Democrats who are running in a primary now in August. However, the obvious likely one to come out of that, the widely accepted favorite is Val Demings, who's a sitting congresswoman from Orange County here in Central Florida. Former police chief in Orlando as well. Famously lost her gun, had her gun stolen, left her gun in her car in a bag and got it stolen while she was police chief. Made a little bit of noise with that. She was also very popular or at least widely spoken about in the Biden Veep stakes back in 2020. So she's the likely Democrat. In addition to those two and myself, there's a couple of NPAs who qualified for the ballot. Gentlemen I bumped into or spoke a tiny bit with when I was in Tampa a couple weeks ago. Tuan Nguyen goes by TQ, but he's one of the NPAs who's on there. There's another NPA out of Boynton Beach, Stephen Grant, and a handful of write-in candidates have qualified as write-in candidates as well. So, yeah.
And I take it that Rubio is going to be your biggest challenger, followed by Demings.
That's those are obviously the like I say, the big favorites. Those are the big names in the race. Those are, I think, the names that elevate the race to kind of more national prominence. Obviously, Rubio's a former presidential candidate, possibly future presidential candidate. And really, when he came into the U.S. Senate, he was really one of the faces of the GOP at the time. I forget in which year it was he delivered the GOP response to the State of the Union, even. So
was that the one where he laid out this like 90-point plan on immigration? I remember that. That was my big turnoff a long time ago from him, just like not going from not knowing a lot about him to I'm listening, and he's like, all right, so we're going to offer this plan, and it's going to include this and this and this and this. And I was like, dude, are you going to stop? Holy wow.
I don't remember if it was that one. I remember the whole thing with the water and stuff.
Right.
I just remember what came in when he first appeared on the national scene versus versus obviously where he is today. Obviously his star has fallen tremendously from there. I think when he was first brought up, obviously, at least to me, it was obvious that he was kind of being groomed as like the GOP answer to Obama. You know, let's get a younger guy into the Senate who's got a clearly immigrant name, but he's coming from this other sort of place and everything else. And so obviously Miami would be a great place for that. And you know, like I said, he seemed to be sort of kind of groomed for that sort of role, and obviously didn't quite fit the bill. And you know, I don't know what would have been for him had it not been for obviously Donald Trump showing up in the 2016 primaries. But obviously, you know, Trump really disrupted things for what everyone wants to think about it. Obviously, I'm not someone who regards Trump as really a genuine disruptor or an anti-establishment candidate, but you know, he certainly threw a monkey wrench in some people's plans for the GOP primaries and the presidential race in 2016 in general, because, you know, I don't think as many people could have predicted exactly how everybody responded to him. And so that certainly created an interesting dynamic, and he's a peculiar character in and of himself. So
absolutely. Okay, so let's take this. So we've got your two big candidates, you know, the Republican challenger, you know, the Republican Marco Rubio, and the Democrat Val Demings. Just briefly, what is their major campaign point, and what's your counterpoint to each one of them?
You know, it's funny. For Val Demings, it from everything I see is basically a story, you know, like her personal story, which is a nice story, you know, coming from humble beginnings and going up to being a police chief and a U.S. congresswoman, and all her service, and and like her big popular ad right now is basically, you know, which I find a little bit humorous, is the fact, well, I'm going to show up, you know, because Marco Rubio misses a lot. And to me, well, it's not really substantive of telling you anything of what they're going to do. Even Rubio to a certain extent, although Rubio is a different sort of issue because he's been in the Senate for 12 years now. So he's got a record really that, you know, he can't run that much from. He does try to rework his conservatism, as it were, to appeal to a certain thing, where he has really taken an economic policy stance to be like, well, I'm trying to help the working class, and as much as he will in another breath, you know, deride socialism and Marxism and this and that, when you look at what he's proposing policy wise, it's really all central economic planning, but you know, to help out families or whatever. And in terms of the policy substance of it, to me, you know, it's more of the same, and it's been a clear rejection of liberty and free markets. You know, the idea that too much freedom and economic freedom and some of these sort of things has led to some of the things that he would deride. Again, taking this, I don't want to say as much religious perspective, but sort of religious flavored perspective, because he's a guy who tries to flavor his message in that way. That you know, the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Not disillusion, or the sort of decline of the family unit is in part due to, you know, too much freedom in this way, or you know, and so it needs, you know, to be put on support from government, which is obviously something I reject. I think our natural tendencies are to build family units, and it is what makes us stronger. It has a natural impact to do that. And so we don't need government involvement to sort of incentivize us to it. Just like I don't think we need government to incentivize us towards any good behavior, or to disincentivize us from bad behavior, because bad behavior already has negative consequences, and good behavior already has positive effects as well. So
you're not. So I'm not really getting. Are you saying that Rubio is more running on just a generic social platform, and then Val Demings isn't really got any specific point that she's trying to talk about?
Well, she's just trying to cast herself as, you know, the person fighting for the people, and you know, the slogan that I've heard throughout most of the campaign has been never tire. She'll never tire of fighting for us. But again, it's all in a lot of vague sort of things. You know, she talks about fighting to help people with the price increases due to inflation. Of course, she never wants to tackle the causes of inflation. You know, she's talking about price caps and, and trying to strong arm industries into lowering prices. But there's no real understanding of or either not an understanding or simply a refusal to deal with it.
Okay.
I recall seeing her talk about the Federal Reserve is our most important tool in fighting inflation, which is sort of humorous. But again, to me, at least, certainly my perception of it is that there's not a signature issue. It's not like I'm going. It's not like I'm trying to think. Like where you signature assign associate a politician, like for example, an AOC with a Green New Deal or something like
Okay.
that. There's not a signature piece of legislation, I would say. If I was going to identify one, maybe I'd identify Marco Rubio with red flag laws. Although I'm not sure he voted for the most recent iteration of that went through the Senate, but he's been sponsoring red flag law legislation for quite a few years now, since at least 2019. Val Demings, I know, at least voted for the last year's NDAA, which included provision for red flag laws applying to the military. So she's certainly on board with that. She's been a strong advocate for gun control as well. So there's been a smattering of things, but I don't think I don't think there's a defining issue with each one of them. What they want to define themselves with is a sort of broader sense of, again, in Val Demings' case, as being, this woman of the people who will fight and will show up for everyone. With Marco Rubio, his kind of established bona fides as a conservative legislator. He's promoted quite a bit the endorsement that he's got from the overwhelming majority of Florida sheriffs, and I think the Fraternal Order of Police, obviously juxtaposed against the fact that he's running against a former cop, a former police chief herself. So that presents an interesting dynamic, something I found, I don't want to say humorous, but just, obviously they're both kind of fighting for that demographic because she comes from it and he obviously depends on it. So I see her very often touting her support for, increasing federal funding for police, and whether that's for units to deal with unsolved violent crimes or whether it is for buying more body cams, whatever it is. Obviously, we have a little bit different perspective in terms of how to deal with some of those issues, and that's always stuff I like to talk to. I'm happy to position myself as the one candidate who's not afraid to call for ending qualified immunity and having real accountability for everybody.
So are there does that tie into your signature topics that you want to run on?
It's one I enjoy talking about, but I don't know if I'd say it's the signature for me. I mean, I think the big things, or at least where I've tried to put my focus, have been kind of these two that I think, one which has the most devastating effect,
which is,
albeit not at home, which is the foreign policy. Where we're literally killing all these people, and for example, U.S. support for the war in Yemen. Biden sent troops over last month, and of course sent a letter to Congress who explaining this, which included the fact that he was doing it based off authority given in the 2001 authorization to use military force against the perpetrators of 9/11. I don't know if there's any perpetrators of 9/11 currently fighting in Yemen. I don't think the Houthis are help perpetrate 9/11. We do know that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis and were there helping the Saudis coalition there. So there's that. But our foreign policy, I think, has been one of the most destructive things. And obviously kind of getting into talking about the NDAA, it's something where, and again, the most widely impacting thing for us as in this country is the inflation. And those things are not unrelated. I go back to part of when I first got really engaged into politics was during the Ron Paul runs, a little over a decade ago, starting with the 2008 run. And I think it was during the 2008 primary season. It was one of these debate questions. It's one of the ones I have saved. I think I posted a clip on social media not that long ago. That was this answer to a question about getting rid of a tax. And he started talking about what he refers to, and I would refer to as well, as the inflation tax. And when he describes it, we live way beyond our means with a foreign policy we can't afford, and the entitlement system that we've encouraged. But he talks about the foreign policy first, and this is part of what I'm talking about as well is the foreign policy that we have, which is just bleeding us dry. Again, we're talking. I brought up to you kind of the NDAA. What was proposed, what was passed last year for this year, the fiscal year 2022, was over $750 billion, over 750 billion. I was actually around 762, I think, officially. What's proposed for next year is like 800 and I think over 850 billion. So we're over 4/5 of a trillion at this point. And there's a little bit of variance, I think, between the Senate and House versions of it. But you get the sense of what's going on here, and it's madness.
So before we get into the NDAA, let me ask you, because we've stated now, or you've kind of presented Rubio and Demings as kind of running on these more generic platforms. Demings is kind of running on her story. Rubio's running on his record as more of a conservative type, social conservative. And you're coming in and you're saying, look, I want to talk about the NDAA. I want to talk about inflation. I want to talk about these things. And I think those are good things to talk about. But here's my question to you. We know that the big two generally have a good, how do we want to say it? They have a good hold on elections right now, right? They're major, they're big. They get to drive the conversation.
That's an understatement. That's an understatement.
Right? They get to drive the conversation for good, bad, or whatever, right? So they're not talking about specific policy issues. You want to talk about specific policy issues. So how do you, as a candidate for the Libertarian Party, talk to people and say, all right, let's change this conversation. Let's quit talking about social conservatism and let's quit talking about your story of growing up. Let's talk about meat and potatoes. How do you do that as a candidate and get people's attention?
That's a great question, and it's one of these things where I don't know that I have the secret sauce just yet. Every now and again, these guys will talk about policy because it does have an impact and it's in the news, and so they love to take credit for stuff. Both of them are sitting legislators in the U.S. Congress, so each one of them likes to tout what their perceived successes are, what things that they're up in arms about. Certainly, with the Russian invasion into Ukraine, both of them were certainly keen to blame everything in the world on Putin, and these sort of things. So these all present opportunities where I'm able to highlight sort of things. I've certainly take every opportunity when Val Demings talks about wanting to combat inflation or fight for people in Florida to help them with these rising prices. I make it a point every chance I get to highlight the fact that these inflation action plans that they're talking about, the Democrats in particular are talking about, totally ignore the causes of inflation. And it again, to kind of segue, I'll wait till we get into actually getting into the nuts and bolts of the NDA, but this is a factor here as well. We understand here on our side that the biggest driver of inflation is the fact that the money supply has been expanded so drastically in the last couple of years to fund all the government largesse in response to COVID, or in response to everything that happened as a result of COVID. I don't want to make it seem like the disease itself is necessarily what drove this, but it's all part and parcel. It's the reaction, and it's the government effort to leverage a crisis and make something more of it. Take it as an opportunity. It's really one of the things I find most repulsive in the political establishment is the fact that they treat crises as an opportunity to just push forward an agenda that they kind of always wanted to push forward anyway. You're leveraging people's suffering and tragedy and in many cases deaths to try to push policy, and it's unfortunate. It's certainly when we understand that there's other motives at play in there, rather than a genuine concern for just the people. Anyone who thinks that they're driven just by that, I think, is being a little bit naive. I'm trying to think. I had another thought in there quite about.
So how have you been having the conversation with people? How have you had this conversation with people so far? And how's their response?
The responses I've had from most people are pretty positive. I try to deal with issues that are important to the individuals at each level. So sometimes, so for different communities, that's different. I got quite a kick out of a few weeks ago. I went out, like as I mentioned, to an event in Tampa, which was actually for Eid al-Adha, a Muslim holiday, like I said, a couple weeks ago, and part of their celebration and stuff. And it's funny, like when I interviewed with the folks over there before that, and then going out to the event and talking to people, one of the things I thought was the funniest thing is they asked me a question about immigration. I was talking about, abolishing agencies and stuff like that. And they asked me, well, does that include the TSA? And I'm like, yeah. These people have a little bit different experience of being harassed by government agents at kind of every time they're trying to travel. And so it's just an example where, just taking my own policies or positions and what we recognize as, the expansion of government far beyond what it's supposed to be doing. And just saying that government shouldn't be doing this, and it resonates with certain people differently because of their own experiences, with some other folks, different groups that I've talked to, like, I'm trying to think, like Moms for Liberty or whomever else, where they're kind of focused on stuff with either with education or certainly a lot of groups that came up out of the vaccine mandates and COVID shutdowns and everything. Obviously, their focus has been the things related to that, and so I give them my principles. But what makes it easy for me is just, for us, it's very different. We're not taking polls all the time and trying to, wave our finger in the air, figure out which way the wind's blowing. We have a core set of principles, and I have a core set of principles, so I can just apply my core set of principles and say, here's the answer. And for the most part, at least to my face, it seems to resonate with folks. I've had generally positive responses. Obviously, there's folks out there in the voter base and in the universe who are sort of dyed in the wool, committed to one side or the other, who are resistant to hearing anything. They don't want to hear the fact that their candidate, as I mentioned, we kind of touched on a little bit about the NDA. They don't want to hear that their candidate votes for military spending increases every single year, every chance that they get. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that these guys are expanding government every chance that they get. They don't want to hear any of that. So those kind of folks keep the blinders on, and they're very resistant, and they just want to mock you, or they want to say, look, you got no chance. But the chance that I have is whatever chance voters want to give me. The challenge for me, obviously, is trying to reach voters. So that's part of why we need all the help we can get. Anybody who's run third party or knows anything about running third party understands the challenge that we have is we don't have anywhere close to the resources these guys have. So all the help we can get from folks makes all the difference in the world. So because that's one of the things, we don't need to match them in resources, but we need to get our message out there. And so, we've got a few months ahead of that November election, and we're gonna do everything we can to do that. But we all face certain constraints, so we're gonna do our best.
So when it comes to state and national elections, one of the biggest complaints that people have, or one of the biggest, maybe not a complaint, maybe it's more of a concern, is, hey, you know what? If I vote for you, I risk getting that person who I really dislike in. They might say something like, I could survive with Rubio, but I don't like Demings, or vice versa. I could survive with Demings, but Rubio's a terrible person. And so then the question is, in pulling the vote from them to you, either one of them to you, the question, really is, how do you give us your pitch on inspiring confidence that voting for you isn't a disaster? And I don't mean as far as you are concerned. Sure. I mean, as far as the lesser of the evils.
Yeah. Look, on the one hand, I'd say that's exactly the kind of voting that's gotten us into this situation, where we consistently have two awful choices, and we can either try to break the cycle and change the path we're on, or we can continue on the same path and just continue that slow burn into oblivion. That's one piece of it. Another piece of it is the fact that is really pointing out, because I think this is a sort of unique opportunity where both of these candidates are not particularly really good on this sort of thing. There's a big movement, or has been a big movement in the last handful of years. Part of what helped, I think, Biden get into office was a lot of the upheaval regarding police violence and stuff that went on. Certainly the George Floyd George Floyd's death, on camera, sort of put a
Mhm.
big spotlight on it that had been kind of going on, and a movement that had been building for the last decade, for the better part of the last decade. And when you look at sort of that issue of police accountability, Val Demings is not a real strong candidate for that. Again, there's a lot of other things. As I mentioned, the stuff that I'm talking about, whether it's inflation or foreign policy and stuff, where I also would say she's not particularly good. So Democrats who are concerned about our foreign policy, who are concerned about excess, even if don't share my views, and obviously most of them aren't going to share my views in terms of, well, we should really just cut spending overall. Even still, most of them, I think, agree that we shouldn't be sending all this money overseas to go fight all these wars and to intervene in all these different countries. We are, what's the word I'm looking for? And the same thing with Marco Rubio, for any, dyed in the wool conservative, any genuine, authentic conservative, as they would think, who doesn't want to see any kind of gun control, doesn't support the red flag laws, they've got plenty of issues to have with Rubio as well. And it's simply, I think, trying to help them recognize that their lesser of two evils is not really that much less of an evil. Again, it's sometimes it's hard to break through, but thankfully, I think there is a sentiment, at least in some sectors of those voter bases, where they are dissatisfied, and I've seen folks on both sides who are, maybe somewhat tolerating them, but are dissatisfied, and some that aren't tolerating them and that are looking for alternatives, and so they're looking around for alternatives, and so it's just trying to reach those folks. I think there's fertile ground, because I don't think these are great candidates, even if they're notable candidates. I don't think they're great candidates, and I think it's an opportunity for us. But the challenge is reaching folks. I think the biggest thing is that, and obviously my style is a little bit different because I'm focused on the policy. I'm trying to focus on things that are going to actually affect people. It's not enough for me to say, hey, I'll show up. Showing up seems like the bare minimum anybody could do in a job.
Right.
So for me, I really try to focus on these specific things,
Okay.
and just bring that message forward.
Let's get an audience member question in, because we've got one here. And, speaking of fertile ground and people that might be willing to vote for you. So let's see what we have to say here. So I'm going to pull this up on the screen. And this one is from, I believe it's Josie Gentry. My mother's maiden last name, actually, Gentry. Just a fun fact for everybody. But Josie says that I found many to believe in open borders and doesn't believe in CODIS of the USA. I wonder if that was meant to be POTUS. I'm not sure what CODIS is exactly.
No, I'm saying, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. What does Dennis say about that? About those in the Libertarian Party that advocate for no government constitution or, I believe, open borders, because the follow-up was those are issues. Josie is saying that those are issues that turn them away from the Libertarian Party. So let's talk about those particular issues and how you would address them.
Sure. So Constitution, and I think that's what he meant by CODIS.
Okay,
I'm
gotcha.
actually a big Constitution guy. I am not. I know there's a lot of my fellow libertarians who like to quote Lysander Spooner and the whole thing about the Constitution of no authority and everything. Look, I recognize the limitations of the Constitution. It is at the end of the day, and I sort of take issue with some of those folks and their perspective on it, because, look, I think the Constitution is great. It gives us a great framework for government. It's probably not the end all be all, in my opinion, but I think it's inspired, and particularly the Bill of Rights is inspired in terms of kind of giving us a basic framework. What we understand as libertarians to say that, look, you just shouldn't violate anyone's life, liberty, or property, and if you don't do that, you should be free to exercise your rights to the same without any interference from government or anyone else. But not everybody gets it that way, and so I think the Constitution, like I said, in particular, the Bill of Rights, lays out a lot of these basic things in a way that is easy to interpret for most people, and trying to put these things down. For as much as some folks may deride it and say, well, look what a failure it's been. It hasn't really stopped any of this stuff. Look, it's words on a paper. It's words on a paper. It can't do anything if us, the people, don't work to uphold it or to hold accountable people in power who refuse to uphold it. If we're not willing to stand up for it, it's not going to do anything. Again, it's words on a paper. But I think it does give us a good framework. And, to quote the to paraphrase or take from a good quote from Thomas Sowell when he talks about whenever people are proposing a new policy, one of the things he says, you got to ask 3 questions. And I believe the first one is compared to what? When you say that the Constitution isn't good, compared to what? Look around the world, look at every other country. And, we certainly have some problems, but if you want to trade off, and certainly with every industrialized nation, do you think we've done a better or worse job of preserving our rights? Do we have problems with freedom of speech? Sure. But compared to what? How many other industrialized nations do a better job of protecting freedom of speech than the United States? Again, we can be better, and I certainly want us to be better.
Mhm.
But the right to keep and bear arms, what industrialized nation better protects that right than the U.S.? Again, we can improve. We got a lot of room for improvement, and I'd like to see us make that improvement. I want to fight for that improvement. But who's doing better than we are with the Constitution? So Constitution, I'm a big advocate for the Constitution. I think if we simply follow the Constitution, 9th and 10th Amendment especially, really applying everything else, if we just followed the Constitution, we would not have a huge portion of the big problems we face as a nation. We would not be facing those problems if we simply followed the Constitution. So that's a big one for me, actually. And again, I mentioned earlier, I came from the Ron Paul. I got first inspired to get engaged in politics, and that's something I take from there is from that and a few other places. The fact that really, if we just followed the Constitution, we could avoid so much of the stuff. To the other one about borders, borders exist. Whether you try to impede migration across borders, borders exist. Borders between states exist, even though we don't stop people from traveling across them. So borders exist, and I was take issue with someone saying that, well, we're going to erase the borders. They're not going to erase the borders. The borders are there. It is the boundary of our jurisdiction, of our government, the outer edge of it versus the jurisdiction of another government, at least what we've accepted and recognized as it. But in terms of migration, I think, without getting too much down the rabbit hole, our problem right now is the fact that we have an immigration system that just doesn't work. It's based on defective principles that categorize people into groups, and it's unworkable. It's unworkable, and it's demonstrated by the fact that, we've got 10 million plus people that are in the U.S. undocumented. At the same time, we've got folks in internment camps. You've got the specter of, what was going on. I guess it was last year when you had, these, border agents on horses whipping Haitians as they're coming over and stuff.
Mm-hmm. I remember
that. All this crazy stuff and everything, and nothing's working. The idiocy of building a wall on the border. All of this stuff is a mess because we're trying to find a way to, some kind of strategy or amount of spending to enforce a policy that just doesn't work. It incentivizes the worst kind of behavior for so many of these people where there's no legal route for them to come in. Well, if there's no legal route for you to come in, what's the path of least resistance? Well, it's to come in illegally. So we've created this dynamic because we've got stupid policy that treats people as groups rather than as individuals. As a libertarian, I believe in treating people as individuals. And from as an American perspective, traditional American perspective, I think let's go back to our traditions, treating people as individuals. Something similar to an Ellis Island model. We can get more into depth with it, but something like that, I think, would be a lot more workable, where you could actually document people coming in, and you could have a more open society, and again, also allow the market to work. I really do not trust the government. The government is so bad at everything else. I don't think that they are capable of doing a good job of deciding, how many of these people we should have in, and how many of those people we should have in, and who in all this. I don't think government's very, very well suited towards that task, and certainly not meeting the needs of the market, where there is a demand to have more people here, there, wherever, to fill these needs in our different communities. And we've seen issues where those needs haven't been met because of clampdowns on immigration. So it's a more complex topic, but it's one where I don't want people to mix up this idea of that by changing our policy or abandoning the really broken, misguided policy that we have would be somehow, well, we don't have borders and we don't have a nation. We have borders, we have a nation. It's just a question of what is going to be our rules, or how are we going to treat people who want to come here. What's going to be our rule set? Right now, the rules that we have, the bureaucracy that we have doesn't work. And it doesn't work not because we're not spending enough money or not because we've got the wrong strategy or something. It's because the underlying principles are they're just wrong. They're just wrong principles. And because they're wrong principles, there's no amount of strategy and no amount of money you can spend that's going to make it work because it's just broken. So it'll just be a money pit and you'll continue to have this chaos. So what I want to do is I want to see us totally revamp that. And again, get away from this idea of treating people in groups and instead treat people as individuals. The way we all want to be treated is the way we treat other folks. So.
Awesome. So let's jump into a bill review. I'm going to play this little intro clip really quick, and then I'll bring you right back, Dennis. So don't go anywhere, folks. We're going to switch to the next segment.
But I know I'll be a law someday, at least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
All right. So the bill review segment of this show is really just kind of normalizing the idea that we should take a look at the bills in as much as we can, and that you can actually learn a lot. And you don't have to necessarily be a lawyer or somebody who's already run for office. You can simply be a regular lay person, just like myself, who says, you know what, I'm going to crack open this bill and I'm going to pour me in some cases, pour a very large drink, because some of these bills are very, very long, and just take a crack at reading it and trying to understand what it's saying and seeing if it matches up with what I want. So in this particular case, what I do is I ask all the candidates who come on to give me a bill. The bill doesn't have to be something within the purview of the office that they're running for, but that tends to be the goal. And so what I do is I just say, hey, give me this bill, and I'll try to take a read and pick out some things, and then I'll discuss it with the candidate as well. So in this particular case, Dennis has chosen the Inhofe and Reed fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. And the National Defense Authorization Act, and you'll hear him say NDAA, that has been going on since 1961. So this is an annual budget that the government looks at every single year. So let's bring Dennis back, and we're going to talk about this particular act. Dennis, all right. So I'm going to give you a hard time. At the last minute, just like I might expect a candidate for office, you sent me, I think it was a 900-page bill. Let me see if I don't think I have it up, but it was like 900 pages. And I was like, okay, there's no way I'm going to be reading that whole thing. But honestly, in fairness, if you had sent it to me 2 weeks ago, I still wouldn't have read it. So
no,
I mean, we're in some ways, I'm a candidate as well.
Well, look, it is something where, and this is a point I want to make, like, and something similar to what I think something that's, gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Really along the lines of what you were just mentioning about a regular person trying to understand this. This is the unfortunate reality of our government, is that so much legislation is written this way to be just unintelligible to the average person. Okay. Right. It's hard enough for the average person who's working, hard. They have a family and they're just trying to get by in life. That person, they run into the challenge of just, okay, I've got all my energy here and I've got to get through my job to be able to provide. And certainly now with the inflation the way it is, where people are really having a little more struggles, doubly so. Then you've got obviously the effort you want to put into your family and maybe into your local community. It's real hard to get time to just be engaged in national level politics, period. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think you should have to. Like, the most important thing I think anyone can do, and this is obviously a separate thing and a more personal perspective, is your family. Look, we have a saying or there's a famous quote from a past leader in my church, which is, there's no success that can compensate for failure in the home. So I totally understand anybody whose focus is there. And I'd say even my focus is there, even though I'm trying to do this as well. My number one priority is that if I thought that it needed to, I'd abandon this to focus on stuff with my kids, because this is stuff that there's nobody else who's filling in that gap for me if I'm not taking care of my responsibilities there. So I understand when people, can engage in politics, but the people in politics, the people in power, take advantage of that, and they make everything so inaccessible so inaccessible. It's a similar situation, let me tell you, to what happened when I worked locally, when I was in, when I was serving on the board of supervisors in my old district. We used to meet in the middle of a weekday at 11:30 in the morning on a weekday, 30 miles outside of the district,
Right.
basically. Okay. In the middle of the workday, I had to leave my job in the middle of the day. The other three of the other four people were retired. The other person worked at night. They didn't care. Almost nobody ever showed up to any of those meetings because who had time and could do it. And, nobody was really good about getting the schedule. I would get the schedule out to people to try to come out, but who makes it out at that time? One of the
Right.
first things we did was make meetings accessible. But, this is I think a feature, not a bug. The fact that it is so difficult to understand. Now, obviously, I don't think we're going to sit here and go through, page by page on this bill.
No,
To
but
me,
I'm
it's
going to
looking
pull
at
it up
the
on the screen
totality of it.
here. I
Yeah.
will pull it up on the screen so we can take a look. And luckily, the link that you sent me is actually a very interesting link. And let me see if I can get that up on the screen here so that people can see it. All right, so there we are, perfect. And so this, this comes from James M. Inhofe. I think it's saying his name right, Inhofe.
Yeah.
His website, so inhofe.senate.gov, and it's just kind of like a little summary of the bill. And there were some interesting things that I saw about it, but let me scroll down here because I want to point out something at the very bottom here, and I hope it's visible well enough for everybody. Maybe I can increase the size just a wee bit here, see how that looks. I think that looks a little bit better. So we've got the text of the bill can be viewed here. So we have some links. The bill report can be viewed here. Funding tables can be viewed here. And then click here for an executive summary of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023. So in this particular case, there was quite a bit here to help bring some, you could choose if you're one of the, like a monetary wonk, one of those people that likes to look at, money tables. Then there was there was some information there for you. If you wanted to read the whole like 900, 800 page bill, however that was, that was there, or you could just read a summary. But I think that, I think there's some stuff here that we can talk about. And so what I want to get from you is, he said this bill was developed with the input of all senators to meet this critical moment. And then he says, with the Chinese Communist Party accelerating the already historic modernization of its military, Russia continuing to destabilize security in Europe, and record high inflation, which was the government's own doing, jeopardizing our buying power, Congress must do everything we can to give our military every advantage on the battlefield. To start, that means adequate investment. So it almost feels like they haven't been doing this. But give me your thoughts on this. I mean, is the CCP and is Russia such a threat that we need to increase by, I believe what it said, 45 billion. We need to increase it by 45 billion. And by the way, folks, the bottom line here, or the top line of this, is $847 billion for military and national security programs. So we're increasing it by 45 billion to almost 900 billion. So tell us about that, Dennis.
I think the 45 billion is included in that total. I think that's a 45 billion on top of what the executive branch was asking for. But to go back to one of your points, and something that I held back on a little bit earlier when talking about inflation, was the fact that they included, and I believe the amount that they have stated in here is an extra 13 billion specifically for dealing with inflation, which again is sort of comical because again, it's government spending, which has to be covered at some level by the Fed when they have to just add in more money for money we don't have. Where we're going to account for inflation by, again, creating more inflation. Again, it's the absurdity of it. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic, in the fact that we're just making these problems worse.
Right.
But to me, again, this really goes to sort of the totality of it, and certainly the absurdity and the fear mongering of it. Oh my goodness, the Chinese are just nipping at our heels while they're spending, unless they've had a massive increase, they're still less than like a third of our military budget.
Right.
In
Yes.
terms of what they spend. If you've ever seen the chart, it just looks it looks ridiculous. You see the U.S. Like I say, up until now has been in the mid 700 billions. This obviously wants to push up to the mid 800 billions in terms of defense spending, while the Chinese are somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 billion.
Right.
Russia's not even there. Russia's, around 60 some odd billion, less than 70 billion, last I checked. So, to sort of suggest that they're like nipping at our heels and we need to keep pace and stay ahead of them is really just disingenuous. Neither one of those countries are capable of or are trying to manage a world empire the way that the U.S. sort of is, be it by proxy or intimidation or whatever else. The U.S. what the U.S. foreign policy is and has been is, again, unworkable, and no one can afford it. And because we can't afford it is part of why we're in the situations that we are. But
Right.
these guys, they see no limit, and they will push this narrative, because how else can they justify it? If you recognized that the Chinese have no realistic ability to really combat us, based on the strength of our arms, not even just to say economic strength. A lot of people look at the Chinese and say, well, the Chinese, they do have the second largest economy, but they have the second largest economy on top of a population that's triple the size, and a population that's going to face a real challenge in coming years, due to some of their population, their age distribution in the population. After a generation or two of the one-child policy, they're going to face some real problems soon. And I don't think they're, unlike Japan, who is dealing with a little bit of population decline themselves due to a low birth rate. They haven't achieved the same level of wealth, comparatively speaking. So they're going to have a real hard time dealing with that. They're not going to be in a position to do this. Now, you'll say they're a threat to Taiwan or whomever else, but and that may be true to some degree, but certainly not a threat to the United States.
Right.
There's no scenario. Again, unless somebody really wants mutually assured destruction, which I think we've all sort of outgrown that as a global community. I don't think anyone's seeking that out. But again, we seem to be sort of poking the bear when it comes to our intervention in Ukraine. Which, fun fact, I don't know if you caught this one when doing any of your research, but in amongst our 800 and depending amounts, 40, 50 some odd billion dollars, we I believe there's 100 million in there for training Ukrainian pilots on flying U.S. fighter planes. So again, because we've already not given enough for everything else we've already been doing with Ukraine, upwards of 50 billion that we've given already in direct aid. Here's another 100 million to train them to use then U.S. made aircraft. Again, that doesn't seem like it'll be antagonistic at all to the Russians.
Right.
If they now have Ukrainian fighter pilots over there.
Yeah, I don't know if you see it on the screen, but I did pull up maybe not that particular thing because there's
that's a little bit more,
like 800 bills. But this one points out and it says extends and modifies. So let me back up for a second. So what we're looking at here, folks, is the remember the links that I pointed out on the bottom of the page of the link that Dennis sent me. There were some links. So this is the executive summary that we're looking at. So this is basically, rather than, it's like 30 pages. And what it does is it kind of summarizes everything, because when you look at the actual bill, when you go down, it looks like a wish list was sent from each one of the now 5 armed forces, because the Space Force was included in there as well, right? So you've got the Navy, the Army, the Marines, Air Force. I guess it would be 6 because you've got the Coast Guard. I think the Coast Guard was in there as well. So you're talking about 6 basically, right? So the Space Force is now in there. So it says extends and modifies the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and authorizes $800 million in fiscal year 2023 to provide security assistance to Ukraine via this authority. So we're giving them $800 million to Ukraine for next year. Okay, so we've already kind of planned out like, hey, we need to give this other country which a lot of us arguably say we shouldn't even be involving ourselves in. We're giving them $800, right? And I did point out a couple of other things. I want to respect your time, so we're going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly because we went a little bit long. But let's take a look at some of the other stuff that I've highlighted here. So that's page 2. Page 3 authorizes an increase of $85 million for impact aid. $50 million for supplemental impact aid, $20 million for impact aid for military children with severe disabilities, $15 million for impact aid for schools affected by base closures, force structure changes, or forced relocations. And it might sound mean that I'm pointing this out, but remember, this is the National Defense Authorization Act. We also broadens the reach and impact of the basic needs allowance by increasing the eligibility threshold and allowance size from 130% of the federal poverty line to 150% of the federal poverty line. I'm assuming what that means is it increases based on where you fit in comparison to the federal poverty line. So if the government's paying you and you're kind of somewhere close to the poverty line, I'm not entirely certain what this is, but it doesn't seem to really relate specifically to defense. Because remember, what I read was with the Chinese Communist Party accelerating the already historic modernization of its military and Russia continuing to destabilize security in Europe, and record high inflation, we must do everything. Congress must do everything we can to give our military every advantage on the battlefield. And so it just seems like we're just finding ways to spend money.
You think?
Yeah.
I mean, look, and I'd say that, and I'd say a couple things. Things like that might get highlighted at times to sort of try to present these things in a way that makes it unassailable. Like, you don't care about the soldiers and their families, and honestly, and I don't know if that falls into this section. Like, if you look on the monetary breakdown where it has like the military personnel, I don't know if this necessarily falls into that. But like I say, for example, in this section where it talks about, some of the stuff, the appropriations for the military personnel themselves, that's at 179 billion. So I don't know if it quite includes those amounts, but per se, the 179 billion, that's, I don't want to say a drop in the bucket compared to the whole thing, but we're talking about over 800 billion. So obviously money going to a lot of places that is not, the soldiers and their families and all this sort of thing.
Right.
That's the kind of story and the narrative that we get fed by these folks. Well, we got to increase to help them out with this, that, and the other thing. And I would say rather than increasing, maybe we reroute some of the spending that's being done other places that we don't need to, because we know that the lion's share of this is going to go to other things. And so, but no, that's one of those things. And I'd even say in a general sense, as much as us libertarians, and this is not a welfare situation. Obviously, these are people who are working, who've made a real sacrifice. But, spending government money, as much as we may think, on these, big healthcare programs and other things like that, we may think that those are really bad in the sense of, in a certain sense. Using taxpayer money to do those things is a whole lot better than spending them on other things like, drones to go drop bombs all over Pakistan and things like that. Certainly helping the Saudis or giving foreign aid. I don't know if there's anything comparable in this one, but last year's NDA included an extra $1 billion for Israel's Iron Dome. It's one of these things where, those are the things where and like you brought up the 800 million for Ukraine, being added in there. Again, we're 30 trillion in debt. We got to have a little bit of perspective here, because it's not just the overall absurdity of we're going to have a military budget over $840 billion, but it's the context of it. We are 30 trillion in debt. We are facing inflation between 8 and 9%, maybe higher. Depending on how you calculate. If you're just looking at your food prices, you probably think it's higher. And that's the context of this. So even in this situation, we ended a little over a year ago, we ended the longest war in American history. We left Afghanistan. We are facing record debt, record inflation, and we're going to spend more. Right. We're going to spend more. Is there really that the nature of the threat? The Soviet Union's been gone for 30 years. The Soviet Union was the last real competitor to the U.S. as a global superpower. And we can say whatever we want about China. Look, China's has its problems, and certainly they have erred more towards the side of central planning and just I mean they're by their own admission a communist government. So unless you really believe that communism is a real legit path to prosperity, you shouldn't really have a tremendous amount of fear here. They're not in a position to compete with us, and I make the point as often as I can. We could literally cut this budget in half. We could cut the budget for 2022 in half, and we would still be the number one country in the world. We would still be the number one country with by a margin of over 100 billion from number two. That's how far out we would be ahead, and still probably be more than the next 2 or 3 or 4 countries combined. Still, even if we cut our budget literally in half. So the idea that we need to do this to keep pace with, like you're saying, with all these threats that we have, is just totally bogus. This is, I made a video about the last NDA passing, and I led off and ended it with the clip from President Eisenhower's farewell address, because that's where the term was coined, the military-industrial complex, where he talks about the dangers of this. I don't know how anybody can look at what's gone on, and particularly over the last couple of decades, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union, and look at our military spending and say, wow, we really heeded that warning. I don't think anybody can look at the situation and say that. And I think it's really important for us to start heeding that warning and recognize, where we're headed with this and what's wrong with it. And for those who are concerned about, the founding fathers and really what is the path that this nation is supposed to be on, they never envisioned anything like this. They certainly weren't perfect in a lot of other things that they did, and we can have other debates about that. But this country was never meant to do this sort of thing, and to pursue this kind of policy and to bankrupt itself, going around the world looking for boogeymen to fight and to wage war everywhere they can so that we can keep the money flowing to the defense industry. So it's one of these things where, again, it's an opportunity for me to draw a sharp contrast. As I mentioned, Marco Rubio votes for every NDAA. Val Demings votes for every NDAA. They will vote for all these spending increases, even though the spending increases, this still needs to go through appropriations and things like that. But obviously this has a big impact in terms of driving that as well. But those guys, they vote for all that, and I will vote against it. So, and if there's no other simple distinction on it, I will not vote for this sort of thing. And I will offer amendments to cut huge amounts of spending because, number one, we can't afford it. And if we can't afford it, that should draw a line for anybody. That's how we have to operate as regular people. We can't buy things we can't afford. And we certainly can't do it year after year after year after year after year, to just keep on spending ourselves into endless debt. If it's not something we can do, and each one of us has to have the minimum ability of self-control to be able to stop ourselves from doing that. If we can do that, and we have to do that, why isn't government? Why shouldn't government? Because we're paying the price now as well. Yep. And I'll add one last thing into it. This foreign policy does not make us safer. This is the foreign policy that created, that radicalized and created the situation that led us to 9/11, where people were willing to do that to attack us, and it will inspire, and it continues to inspire the next generation of extremists. Whatever form they take and whatever ways that they decide to try to attack and to do harm to Americans, this is what drives it. And there's something, a great little article of note, if anybody out there who's never seen it or read it, it was written by the year 2000 and the year 1996 Libertarian presidential candidate, Harry Brown. It's called When Will We Learn? This was written on September 12th of 2001. So literally the day after the attack, when I think a lot of us really didn't have a whole lot of perspective on what had happened. A lot of us were just, sort of in our emotions and outraged about it, and justifiably so. But, there's a bit of perspective at a time when you need it the most about what happened and why it happened. And I think it's still very relevant. When will we learn, this foreign policy that we have? And this is the monetary side of it. This is how it gets funded. Because obviously the president is the one who sort of, is commander in chief of the military and decides a lot of these things, even though Congress is supposed to declare war. But Congress controls the purse strings, man. Congress controls the money. And look, if we can do nothing else to restrain this foreign policy, at a bare minimum, we control the money, or I say Congress controls the money, and should be able to rein this in by doing so. If no other way, we can rein this in. But you need people in there who are willing to do it. The establishment candidates, who I would say epitomize the worst of the establishment, that being Rubio and Demings, they're going to continue on with this. I honestly couldn't tell you what the other qualified candidates, the NPAs and all them, I don't know what they would do, but my guess is that they would caucus with one side or the other. And they just kind of go with the flow on this because it's so important. And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to go with the flow. I'm running because I want to give people an alternative that is serious, that is committed to saying we got to draw the line in the sand. And this is one of those areas where we need to draw the line in the sand. And that's where I stand on it.
All right. Awesome. So tell people, let's wrap this up. Tell people where they can find you, how they can donate, all that good stuff. Give us your final words before I close this out.
So just look at my last name, my strange last name, Misigoy, and just put a .com after it, Misigoy.com. That's the website. If you're on a desktop, there's a button in the top right corner. If you're on a mobile, it'll be at the top, right under the title. And you click on that donate button and you can go in there, fill out the form, contribute what you can, just before it hurts, but we need all the help we can get. Okay. So please, I ask you guys to be generous, because like I said, we don't have the resources. I don't think we need to have the same resources as the other guys, but we need to be able to reach people. And right now that's a challenge. Come onto the website, follow on social media as well. I try to put out as much as I can, but again, it is a challenge. We're a small organization, small group of volunteers. So we need all the help we can get. We want to reach as many people in the state so that they understand they have an alternative and what that alternative is. Misigoy.com, Misigoy.com. You can just go straight /donate. If you happen to be one of the folks who loves Bitcoin and wants to use that as the future, we accept Bitcoin donations now as well. So you can do that in addition, but obviously we're taking US dollars as well. So please help us out so that we can reach the folks who need to hear this message with it. So trying to think, am I missing anything else? All the social media stuff on Facebook and on Instagram is @ElectMisigoy. On Twitter is @DennisMisigoy. So all together. Trying to think, am I missing anything else?
I think that's it.
All right.
Awesome. Because everything can at least be found from your website, if nothing else.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
You can go from there. There's not a nice name for it or a nice link for it, but you can find the link to the YouTube channel as well through the website. So,
awesome.
And there's also my latest live stream is there on the top, on the front page usually. So you can go from there, and that can kind of get you where you need to go as well. So
awesome. And I'll be providing links in the show notes. So if you have any trouble, just make sure you come back to my stream, and you'll find all the links that you need to the bill, to Misigoy.com, to the Harry Brown article. We'll put it all in there. Make sure that it's that you can find everything that you need that you heard from this episode. And Dennis, I want to thank you very much for coming on. Thank you very much for getting up so early in the morning and bearing that out. And hopefully you had your water, your cup of coffee, whatever it is that you do in the morning to get you going. Hopefully you've had that. And I'm going to wish you well.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come on, man.
Awesome.
Really appreciate it. I got to get out there and get a visit with you guys soon, man.
Absolutely. We'll be here at all time. Come out here anytime. We got you.
All right, man.
All right.
Again,
have
really
a good one.
appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, folks. So that's all for this episode. To see videos for this episode and others, head over to youtube.libertydad.com and be sure to connect with me at Liberty Dad on Facebook. It's all one word, and Liberty Dad Pod on Twitter. Or send me an email or hate mail to libertydadpodcast@gmail.com. I would absolutely love to hear from you. And remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. Have a great week. Catch you next time, and I'm out.